Let's back up a little bit. So can you describe what the past several days have been like, from the summit to President Trump saying he misspoke to even today?
Well, I think it's really been a national nightmare. The president went to Europe and castigated NATO, talked about the European Union as a foe of the United States, and then to cap it all off, went and had a summit with Vladimir Putin where he essentially told the world in the presence of this former KGB officer that he didn't trust his own intelligence agencies, that he had every reason to believe Putin's denials of Russian meddling in our election, and then came home and questioned whether we should meet our commitments to NATO and the collective defense article of NATO, and said the Russians pose no threat in the future to our election, the midterm elections, and then had to walk that back, and then said something else and had to walk that back, and here we are with all of our heads, I think, spinning.
Obviously, they only had two interpreters in there, one for Putin, one for Trump, and this effort to subpoena this person, the interpreter, is this an effort to find out what was exactly shared between the two?
Yes. It's of enough concern on a bipartisan basis, and I think probably the strongest statement about this week came from John McCain. If the president was willing to say things that were so destructive of our national interest in public, what was he willing to say in private? What commitments did he make in private? Is the reason why Montenegro came up after he left Helsinki and returned to the United States because that was a seed planted by Putin? We need to know, I think, to protect the country for whatever reason, and Bob Mueller will, I hope, be able to determine whether there is some compromise at work. But for whatever reason, the president has a bizarre affinity for Putin and for other autocrats, but in particular Putin, and it's endangering the United States, it's endangering the NATO alliance, and we need to find out what happened in that 2-hour meeting.
In your experience, well, let's talk about the vote then, the why or how it got turned down.
Well, we had a hearing in the Intelligence Committee today, and we have a right to make a motion to subpoena individuals to testify, and I move that we subpoena the interpreter and have her come and testify in closed session so that we can learn whether the president made commitments that he should not have. And we had a vote on that. Unfortunately, it was voted down by the majority. And I think that's a real disservice to the country. There are times where you have to put country above party, and this is one of them. On a bipartisan basis, members recognize that what the president had to say publicly was hurtful to our national security and our national interests, and they ought to follow their words with deeds and make sure that we can protect the country by finding out what happened.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but this would be the first time that an interpreter would be subpoenaed just for the sole purpose because no one else was in that meeting. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't advisors or at least note takers usually present when two leaders, in this example, President Trump and Putin, wouldn't that be the norm to have more people in that one-on-one meeting?
Absolutely. And, in the meetings that I've had with foreign leaders, and obviously for members of Congress, it's not nearly the same priority as it is for a president. But nonetheless, there are people in the room from the United States, from the embassy, sometimes the ambassador, there to take notes, there to make sure that we understand exactly what that foreign leader has had to say, and so that we know what U.S. representatives are telling foreign governments. Here, though, the President of the United States basically said, Secretary of State Pompeo, I don't want you in the room. National Security Advisor Bolton, I don't want you in the room. General Kelly, I don't want you in the room. I want to be in the room alone. And I'm only going to bring an interpreter because otherwise we can't communicate, but I don't want there to be a witness. Now, that's extraordinary. And, of course, it just adds to the other kind of baffling actions the president has taken when it comes to Russia. So the circumstances are unprecedented. I think the remedy, therefore, is also unprecedented. That is subpoenaing the interpreter. But otherwise, there's no way for us to find out what happened.
How do you respond to those who may say, that this Democrat is just trying to find anything to just cause ruckus or trying to get his name out there attacking the president? How do you respond to those critics? I'm sure you've been hearing about them or hearing of them.
Well, I mean, they can level that criticism of me, but they can't level that criticism of John McCain. And there's nothing that I've said that's been any stronger than what John McCain has said, and other Republicans as well. George Will wrote this week in the Washington Post that what the president did was collusion in plain sight, and we don't even know what he did in private. So this isn't a Democrat versus Republican issue. I think those that are in the mold of Ronald Reagan are appalled at what Donald Trump did. I said earlier this week that Ronald Reagan once said that he didn't leave the Democratic Party left him. Well, this week, the Republican Party left Ronald Reagan. And I think there are a great many admirers of Reagan who are terrified at what the president did and horrified by it, who also want to know whether something in that private meeting is responsible for the public debacle.
There's this new report coming out that shows that says that the president knew of Russian interference more than 2 weeks before being sworn into office. Can you talk about that, touch on that, or add anything to that?
I can't comment on the specifics that were reported. That is in terms of what he was briefed. That's not something I'm allowed to comment on. But I can tell you this: I'm a member of what's called the Gang of Eight, as the ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee. So I was getting high-level briefings during the campaign, during the transition, after the campaign, and so was the president. As a candidate, as the nominee of a major party, you're going to get an intelligence briefing about what's going on. When you become the president-elect, you get a much more intensive briefing, and when you become president, obviously, you get the most sensitive briefings continuously. So there's no way in the world that Donald Trump was unaware of what the Russians did and the strength of the evidence of what the Russians did. But this has been true for obviously for a long time now, and it's not an issue of the president not knowing, not being informed. It's an issue of the president simply being unable to accept the truth, unable to act upon the truth for whatever pathological reason. He just can't bring himself to recognize what happened, and clearly he feels it's a threat to his legitimacy. That's an issue he's going to have to deal with, but the country needs to be protected, and this is the consequence that I'm most concerned about. It's one thing if the Russians have something over his head, but regardless of whether they do or they don't, the actions he's taking are universally destructive of our alliances, of our military and collective security, and this is not just my view, but it runs contrary to everything that Secretary Mattis has been fighting for as well.
I spoke with Senator Kevin De Leon yesterday, and he believes he does believe that Russia, with the way that the president is acting, he believes Russia has something on the president as leverage. He also believes that the president committed an act of treason while in Helsinki and is urging congressional leaders to begin the process of impeachment. First of all, do you think the president has committed an act of treason? And two, what do you think? Do you really think Republicans will follow through with it?
Well, first of all, we haven't been able to really get to the truth in our investigation in Congress because the majority shut it down, I think, when it got too hot for the White House. Bob Mueller, I hope, will get to the truth of whether the Russians, in fact, have compromising information on the president. One of the issues I'm most concerned about is whether the Russians were laundering money through the Trump businesses, and this is why the president is so terrified of people following the money and has tried to draw a red line and prevent the Justice Department from doing that. But if the Russians hold financial leverage over the president, the country needs to know it. And if it's not true, then we should say that also. But we do need to find out. In terms of whether the president should be impeached, I tried an impeachment case in the Senate about 10 years ago involving a corrupt federal judge and learned a lot about what it takes to meet the standard of a high crime or misdemeanor. I think we ought to wait to see what the evidence is. We don't know what Bob Mueller has found. I've probably seen more of the evidence than anyone else, or at least as much as anyone in Congress. But there are a lot of things I don't know that Bob Mueller does, and I think we should reserve judgment. There's only one thing worse than putting the country through the wrenching experience of an impeachment, and that's putting the country through the wrenching experience of a failed impeachment. That's a big step, and one we ought to take reluctantly after we see all the evidence. And so for my part, I want to see the evidence before I make any judgment about that.
Lastly, the motion was, as you said, was voted down by Republicans. What happens next? What's your next move?
Well, in the minority, there are very limited options or limited recourse that we have. I'm working on a resolution now that would condemn the president's comments in Europe and when he returned home. And again, this wasn't merely the summit with Putin, but rather the run-up to that, where he talked about NATO in such disparaging terms and maligned our allies like Germany and France and Britain and Canada. It's the whole picture and portrait that is so disturbing. The disdain the president has shown for our democratic allies, for democratic values, and the fondness that he has displayed for autocrats like Putin and Kim Jong-un. America has always been the champion of democracy around the world. That is one of our most proud and cherished legacies. We fought world wars over preserving liberty and democracy. And now to essentially shun it, shun democratic leaders, and embrace autocracy, I think is a real betrayal of our legacy and our role on the world stage. So, we're going to continue to do what we can to protect the country. But I do think that it's important that my colleagues in the GOP take the blinders off and see what's happening. There's a duty to country far above any duty to party. And the country really needs patriots right now to speak out the way John McCain is.